The air in the courtroom felt thick with anticipation, like the calm before a storm. A young black teen stood there, his hands trembling slightly as he faced the judge, a figure of authority who seemed ready to dismiss him, as if his very presence was a mere inconvenience. It was as if the teenager's race alone had already marked him as inferior in the eyes of the law. But what no one expected was that this teenager would flip the script in a way no one could have predicted. "Do you honestly think you can outsmart me, boy?" the judge sneered, glancing at the teenager over his glasses, a condescending grin tugging at his lips. The courtroom hushed as people waited for the teen's response. But what they didn't know was that this teenager was not just any young man. He was someone with a mind that could challenge even the most experienced lawyers, a future that was brighter than anyone imagined. And when the gavel came down, it wasn't just the start of a case, it was the beginning of a revelation. This wasn't a case about a teenager making a mistake, it was about the inherent biases that rule the system. It was about proving that assumptions based on race are wrong, and that, sometimes, the people you least expect are the ones who make the most profound impact. The day started like any other. The sun was high, and the streets buzzed with the sound of cars driving, people talking, and the hustle of a normal morning. But for Malik Carter, today was different. He wasn't heading to school or meeting friends. Today, he was walking into a courtroom, not as an observer, but as the accused. Malik had grown up in a neighborhood where the odds were stacked against him. He wasn't supposed to excel, at least, that's what society told him. Growing up black in a city with systemic inequality made him aware of the barriers in his way. The expectations were low, but Malik always defied them. He wasn't the typical teenager, he had ambitions that reached beyond the narrow scope that others had set for him. The charge was a simple misunderstanding, an altercation at a convenience store where Malik had tried to defend himself against a rude customer. But somehow, the situation had escalated, and now, here he was, standing before a judge who seemed to have already made up his mind about him. Judge Samuel Turner was an experienced figure, one whose reputation preceded him. He had a no-nonsense approach and a sharp tongue. But what Malik didn't know was that Turner also carried with him deep-seated prejudices. Over the years, the judge had developed a habit of assuming the worst about young black men. It wasn't conscious, but it was there, etched into his mind, influencing his every decision. As Malik stood there, nervously clutching the side of the witness stand, he noticed how the judge looked at him. There was something cold in his gaze. It wasn't just that Malik was the defendant, it was the way the judge viewed him, the implicit judgment based on his skin color. It was a look that Malik had seen countless times before, the assumption that a black teen could never be more than what others expected of him. "You're going to sit there and tell me that you didn't provoke this incident?" Judge Turner's voice echoed in the courtroom, and Malik could feel the heat of the question settle like a weight on his chest. "I didn't provoke anything, Your Honor," Malik said, trying to steady his voice, but his heart was racing. He knew how this was going to go. He had seen it before on the news, heard the stories from friends, black teens, falsely accused, their words ignored, their fates already sealed before they even stepped foot in a courtroom. The judge's eyebrows raised, and the room grew even quieter. Turner seemed almost disappointed, as if Malik's claim of innocence was some sort of preposterous lie. It wasn't that the evidence wasn't on Malik's side, it was that his story didn't fit the narrative the judge had already constructed in his mind. Malik had expected this, the skepticism, the disbelief, but it still stung. He had learned the hard way that the system was rarely fair, especially for someone like him. But Malik was determined. He knew that his future was at stake, and he couldn't let this moment define him. He wouldn't let the system win. The prosecutor presented their case next, and once again, it seemed as though the cards were stacked against Malik. He had expected the legal system to be biased, but the complete disregard for his truth hurt more than he anticipated. As the prosecutor spoke, their words were sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. They painted Malik as an aggressive, angry young man who had done more than simply defend himself, they made it seem as though he had intentionally sought out conflict, as if it was in his nature to lash out. The prosecutor even referenced Malik's background, his neighborhood, his friends, and yes, the color of his skin, as if these factors alone were enough to confirm the accusations. Malik clenched his fists. The anger was starting to build inside of him, but he couldn't afford to let it show. He had to stay calm. He had to prove that the assumptions being made about him were wrong. And as much as the courtroom was turning against him, Malik knew that his mind was his greatest weapon. When it was his turn to speak, Malik took a deep breath and stepped forward. He looked at the judge, then at the jury, and finally at the prosecutor who had painted him as a villain. "I didn't come here today to fight. I came here to tell the truth," Malik began, his voice steady. "I'm not here because I want to be. I'm here because I was forced to be. I did what I had to do to protect myself. And if I hadn't, I wouldn't be standing here right now." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Protect yourself?" Turner asked, his tone dripping with doubt. "You expect me to believe that?" "Yes, Your Honor," Malik responded firmly. "Because it's the truth. You can choose to believe whatever you want, but I know what happened. And if I had let that man push me around, things could have gone much worse. But I don't expect you to understand that. You've already made up your mind." The courtroom fell silent. For the first time, Judge Turner looked uneasy. Malik's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Please support by liking, subscribing, and sharing if you're enjoying the story. Your support helps us create more content. Stay tuned for the continuation of Malik's journey. As Malik stood there, feeling the weight of the judge's gaze upon him, something inside of him shifted. He had been in this position before, where his voice felt ignored, where his truth was dismissed, but this time, he wasn't going to back down. The judge, though outwardly composed, had underestimated him. And Malik could feel it. He could sense the doubt, the subtle prejudice that clouded the judgment of everyone in this room. Judge Turner's face hardened as he scanned the room, clearly uncomfortable with the challenge Malik had presented. For a moment, the air in the courtroom was still, too still. It felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to break the silence. The prosecutor leaned forward, smirking as if he had already won. "Your Honor, I'd like to remind you that this young man has a history of violence, and this particular incident is just another example of his inability to control his temper," he said, his words dripping with condescension. Malik could feel the sting of those words. His history was being used against him, his past mistakes, his environment, everything was being twisted to fit a narrative they had created. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood, yes. But that didn't define him. That didn't make him any less worthy of dignity and respect. Malik held his ground. He knew he had to stay calm, to show them that he was more than their assumptions. He was a young man with a future, with potential, and he wouldn't let them take that away from him just because of the color of his skin. "I don't have a history of violence, Your Honor," Malik said, his voice clear and steady. "I've made mistakes, sure. But I've learned from them. I've worked hard to change, to be better. I'm not the person they're making me out to be." Judge Turner remained silent, his expression unreadable. But Malik saw it, the flicker of doubt, the hesitation in the judge's eyes. For a split second, Malik thought that maybe, just maybe, the judge was beginning to listen. As the days went on, Malik's trial became a spectacle. News outlets picked up the story, spinning it as a typical case of a young black man in trouble with the law. Headlines flashed across TV screens, social media exploded with debates, and everyone had an opinion on Malik's case. But none of them knew the full story. The media painted Malik as just another statistic, another example of a broken system. They didn't know about the hours he spent studying late into the night, the dreams he had of becoming a lawyer, of changing the very system that had wronged him. No one talked about the volunteer work he did at his local community center, helping younger kids stay off the streets. They didn't talk about how he was a mentor to his younger brother, teaching him that there was more to life than what society expected from them. All they saw was a black teen in a courtroom, fighting for his freedom. But this wasn't just about freedom, it was about respect, dignity, and the right to be seen as a person, not a stereotype. During a break in the proceedings, Malik sat in the back of the courtroom, his mind racing. He could hear the conversations happening around him, whispers about his case, about what they thought he was capable of. It was all so painfully familiar. They didn't see him. They didn't see the real Malik, the one who wanted to make a difference, the one who had dreams beyond the limitations they had placed on him. But Malik wasn't going to let them define him. He had a plan. He had a strategy. He wasn't going to let this trial be his end. No, this was just the beginning. The next day, Malik's defense lawyer, a seasoned attorney named Claire Thompson, presented a new angle on the case. She argued that the incident was a result of racial profiling, that Malik had been unfairly targeted because of his race. She laid out the facts, the police report, the surveillance footage, the testimonies from bystanders, everything that supported Malik's version of events. Judge Turner seemed unimpressed, but Malik noticed something. For the first time, the prosecutor seemed a bit more defensive. They hadn't expected this angle. They had assumed that Malik would simply plead guilty, or worse, accept a plea deal and disappear into the system like so many others before him. But Malik wasn't like the others. He wasn't going to just fade into the background. This was his moment to speak out, to show the world that the system could be challenged, that the assumptions made about him could be disproven. "I was in the store, Your Honor," Malik said during his testimony, his voice unwavering. "I was minding my business, just trying to get what I needed. I wasn't looking for a fight. But when that man started yelling at me, I didn't have any choice but to defend myself. And the way I was treated afterward, that's something I've seen my whole life. I'm always the one to be blamed, the one to be punished. But I'm tired of it." The courtroom fell silent once again, and for the first time, Malik felt like his voice was being heard. The judge didn't interrupt. The prosecutor didn't object. Everyone just listened. As the trial continued, something began to shift in the room. People were starting to look at Malik differently. The jury, who had been quiet and reserved, now seemed more engaged. The judge, though still skeptical, appeared to be reconsidering his stance. It wasn't just Malik's words that were changing things, it was his courage, his unwillingness to accept the fate that society had decided for him. The prosecutor, sensing the tide turning, tried to shift the narrative. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "this is just another case of a young man who thinks he's above the law, who believes he can outsmart the system." But the jury wasn't buying it anymore. They saw the truth that Malik was no different from anyone else. He was a teenager trying to protect himself, trying to survive in a world that often didn't care about his survival. Malik could feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. He wasn't alone in this fight. People were starting to see him for who he truly was, not as a stereotype, not as a statistic, but as a person. Please support by liking, subscribing, and sharing this story if you're enjoying it. Your support means the world to us. Stay tuned for more of Malik's journey. As the days passed, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Every moment, every word spoken, felt like it could change everything for Malik. The longer he stayed in the witness stand, the more he realized that this wasn't just about his case, it was about something bigger. It was about challenging the systems in place that were designed to break people like him. Judge Turner had tried to dismiss him at every turn, using his authority to belittle Malik's words and intentions. But Malik wasn't backing down. He could see the subtle changes in the jury's expressions, the small flickers of doubt in their eyes as they watched him stand tall, despite everything they assumed about him. They had come to understand something: the prejudices that often guide decisions are not always visible, but they are always present. But Judge Turner's sneer hadn't wavered. The judge continued to view Malik with suspicion, as if every word he spoke was an act of defiance. It was clear to Malik now, Turner wasn't just a judge, he was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. It wasn't just the judge, it was the way the system had been designed to keep people like Malik in their place. Malik had expected some pushback, but what he didn't expect was how personal the attack on his character would feel. As the defense presented more evidence to disprove the allegations against Malik, Turner seemed to grow increasingly agitated. The room was growing tense, the air thick with the unspoken words between the judge and the defendant. "You've had your say, young man," Judge Turner finally snapped, his voice growing louder. "But I can't ignore the fact that this is an ongoing pattern. Young black men like you have a history of violence and aggression. I'm not sure I believe anything you're saying." Malik felt a rush of anger rise within him. It wasn't just the judge's words, it was the history behind them. The stereotype that black people were more prone to violence, that they were always guilty, always dangerous. It was a stereotype that had been ingrained in this country for generations, and Malik was tired of living with it. "You're wrong," Malik said, his voice shaking but firm. "I'm not the problem. You are. You're the one who's blinded by this system that's been rigged from the start. You're the one who can't see me for who I really am. I'm not just another black kid in trouble. I'm a person. I have dreams. I have a future. I'm not your enemy." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a provocation. But as Malik said them, something changed. For a moment, Judge Turner hesitated. For just a fraction of a second, his steely expression faltered. But then it was gone, replaced once again by his usual indifference. The jury, however, was a different story. Malik could feel their eyes on him, could sense the shift in the room. The judge may have been unmoved, but the people who were supposed to deliver justice were beginning to listen. After days of deliberation and argument, the final moments of the trial had arrived. Malik's future hung in the balance. The courtroom was packed with people, some who had come to support Malik, others who had come to watch his downfall. The judge called for a recess, but the atmosphere remained thick with anticipation. Malik could barely focus on what was happening around him. All he could think about was how much was riding on this. He had come so far, but would it be enough? Would the jury see through the cloud of prejudice that had surrounded him from the moment he entered this courtroom? As Malik sat in the back, waiting for the final deliberations to unfold, he felt a presence beside him. He turned to see Claire Thompson, his defense lawyer, standing there with a calm, determined look on her face. "You've done well, Malik," she said quietly. "I know it's hard, but you've shown them who you are. That's all you can do." Malik nodded, but his mind was racing. He hadn't done enough yet. There was still the possibility of a guilty verdict, the possibility of being sent to jail for something he didn't deserve. He had worked so hard to get to this point, but was it enough? A few minutes later, the court reconvened. Judge Turner took his seat, and the jury filed back into the room. The judge looked down at his papers, his expression unreadable, before finally addressing the room. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The silence in the room was deafening. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman of the jury said. "We find the defendant not guilty on all charges." A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. For a moment, Malik couldn't breathe. Not guilty. Those words rang in his ears like a sweet melody he had never expected to hear. It was a victory, but it was more than that. It was a moment of justice, of proof that things could change, that biases could be overcome. But it was also a painful reminder of how far society still had to go. Judge Turner's face remained stoic, but Malik saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes. He wasn't happy about this verdict. He hadn't wanted to believe Malik's story, and now he had to. As Malik left the courtroom, the weight on his shoulders had been lifted, but the burden of what he had gone through still lingered. He had won, but at what cost? The system was still broken, and as long as it remained the way it was, there would always be people like him, people who had to fight for their place in a world that judged them before they even opened their mouths. But Malik had changed. The boy who had walked into that courtroom, nervous and uncertain, was no longer the same. He had stood up for himself, for his dignity, for his right to be treated as an equal. He had faced the biases that had been built into the very fabric of society, and he had overcome them. But this wasn't just his victory. It was a victory for everyone who had been unjustly judged, for everyone who had ever been overlooked simply because of their race, their background, or their appearance. Malik had shown them all that it was possible to fight back, to make a difference. Malik knew that the fight wasn't over. He knew that this moment was just one small step in a much larger journey. But he also knew that as long as he kept fighting, as long as he kept speaking out, things could change. And that was enough for now. Please support by liking, subscribing, and sharing this story if you've been inspired by Malik's journey. Your support means everything and helps us bring more powerful stories like this to life. The victory felt like a dream, but as Malik walked out of the courthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was bittersweet. Yes, he was free. Yes, the jury had found him innocent, but what about everyone else? What about the other young black men who had been in his shoes and never made it out? What about those who didn't have the resources to fight back, the ones who couldn't afford a good lawyer, or those who didn't have the opportunity to stand up for themselves the way he had? Malik knew the system wasn't perfect. He had been lucky. His case was high profile because of his determination and the injustice he had faced. But so many others were silently suffering under the weight of racial profiling, police brutality, and societal expectations that held them back. It was a sobering realization. Still, Malik couldn't let that take away from his moment. He had fought and won, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been dismissed or underestimated because of their skin color. He knew there was still so much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had the power to make a real change. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind for Malik. The media continued to cover his case, but the narrative had shifted. No longer was he just the black teen accused of assault. Now, he was the face of a movement, a young man who had stood up to an unjust system and emerged victorious. But even as the headlines hailed his success, Malik felt a deep unease. The system that had nearly swallowed him whole hadn't changed overnight. He was still a black teen living in a world that often saw him as a threat, as something to be feared and controlled. There were moments of celebration, friends and family congratulated him, telling him how proud they were, how inspiring his victory was. But Malik knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. His victory had brought attention to a problem that affected millions of people, but that was only the first step. One evening, Malik sat with Claire Thompson, his lawyer, at a small cafe, reflecting on everything that had happened. "Do you think this will change anything?" Malik asked, his voice filled with doubt. Claire smiled, her eyes bright with a mix of hope and realism. "Malik, your case might have been just one example, but the impact it has had, well, that's the beginning of a much larger conversation. People are talking about race, about injustice, about how the system can be fixed. Your victory has opened doors for others." Malik nodded, but his thoughts lingered on the long road ahead. "I hope you're right. But there's so much work left to do. I don't want to just be a story. I want to be part of something bigger." A month later, Malik was walking through the park when he saw a familiar face in the distance. It was Officer Johnson, the cop who had initially been part of the altercation at the store. He had seen him in the courtroom, his face a permanent fixture of disdain as he testified against Malik. For a moment, Malik considered walking the other way. He didn't want to relive the pain of that day. But then something unexpected happened. Officer Johnson saw Malik, and instead of looking away, he approached him. There was no anger in his eyes, no hostility. Just confusion. "Malik," Officer Johnson said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. I just wanted to say something. Malik raised an eyebrow, unsure of what this conversation would entail. What's this about? He asked cautiously. I don't know how to say this, Officer Johnson continued, his voice shifting between uncomfortable and apologetic. I was wrong about you. I saw you as just another black teen, someone who was just going to make trouble. But after seeing the way you handled yourself in that courtroom, I realized I was part of the problem. I've always looked at people like you through a lens of fear, and I've been blind to what's really going on. Malik stood there, speechless. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the officer to admit fault, especially not after the way things had gone down in the trial. But this moment, this conversation, was a powerful one. It wasn't just about him proving his innocence anymore, it was about changing minds, one person at a time. I appreciate you saying that, Malik said, his voice calm but firm. But it's not just me you need to make things right with. It's everyone who's ever been treated like I was. You've got to do the work, change the way you see people. The work's not over for any of us. Officer Johnson nodded, looking down at the ground for a moment before meeting Malik's gaze. I know. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I want to be better. Malik watched as the officer walked away, the weight of their conversation settling in. Change wasn't easy, and it wasn't something that could happen overnight. But in that brief moment, Malik had witnessed a shift. It wasn't much, but it was something. As Malik moved forward with his life, he decided to pursue something he had never considered before, law. It wasn't just because he wanted to make sure no one else went through what he had, it was because he wanted to be the one to make a difference, to reshape the systems that had failed him and so many others. He enrolled in a local college, focusing on pre-law. He knew that this would be a long journey, but for the first time, he felt like he was walking the right path. Every step he took felt like a small victory, a reminder that he was more than the world had ever given him credit for. It wasn't just about the law for Malik, it was about changing the world, challenging the assumptions people made based on race, and making sure that no one else was ever underestimated the way he had been. He knew the fight was far from over, but he was ready for it. He had already won once. Now, he was going to keep pushing. Please support by liking, subscribing, and sharing if you believe in Malik's journey and want to see more stories like this. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to life. Malik sat at his desk, the quiet hum of his laptop filling the room as he scrolled through a series of articles. News outlets, social media, even local activists were still buzzing about the trial. But the conversation was shifting in a way that gave Malik hope. People weren't just talking about his case anymore, they were talking about the deeper issues that his case had uncovered. They were talking about racial profiling, systemic bias, and the need for true reform. And Malik had become an accidental voice in that conversation. He thought about the officer, Johnson, and the brief but impactful conversation they had in the park. That moment had given him a sliver of hope, a reminder that change could happen, even if it was slow and painful. Malik realized that he wasn't just a passive observer in this fight. He could take action, he could speak up, and he could push the needle forward. One evening, Malik received a message that would change everything. It was from a local advocacy group that had followed his case closely. They wanted him to speak at an event about racial justice and the need for legal reform. They wanted him to share his story and use his platform to inspire others to stand up for their rights. At first, Malik hesitated. Public speaking was never something he had considered. But as he sat there, the weight of the message sinking in, he realized that this was his moment. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. If he could stand in front of a judge and challenge the system, why couldn't he speak to a room full of people and challenge them to see things differently? The next week, Malik found himself standing before a crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was packed, filled with activists, lawyers, community leaders, and people who had all come together to discuss the very issues that had defined Malik's life. As he took the microphone, Malik paused for a moment. He scanned the room, taking in the faces before him. It was a diverse crowd, black, white, Hispanic, Asian. But there was one thing they all had in common: they all wanted change. And Malik knew that he had the power to make that change happen. "Good evening," Malik began, his voice steady despite the nervous energy surging through him. "My name is Malik Carter. And I'm here tonight to tell you my story, not just the story of my trial, but the story of every young black person who's ever been judged before they even opened their mouths." He paused, feeling the weight of the words he was about to say. "Growing up, I was always told that I had to work twice as hard, that I had to prove myself just to be seen as equal. I was taught that the color of my skin would always be the first thing people noticed about me, and it would always be the thing that determined how I was treated." Malik looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people listening intently. "The system is broken," he continued. "I've seen it firsthand. I've felt it. And I'm here to tell you that it's not just something we can talk about in a courtroom or in an article, it's something we have to change. It's something we have to fight for." The room was silent, but Malik could feel the energy shift. He was no longer just speaking for himself, he was speaking for every person who had been underestimated, every person who had been treated unfairly because of their race. "The problem isn't just that people like me are targeted by the police, or that we're sent to prison more often than our white counterparts. It's that the system has been designed this way from the beginning. It's been designed to keep us in our place, to limit our opportunities, to make sure that we never get ahead." Malik's voice grew stronger as he spoke. He was no longer nervous, he was passionate. He had found his purpose. "And that's why we have to fight. We have to demand better. We have to challenge every system, every institution that's been built to hold us down. We have to make them listen." The event was a turning point for Malik. The response was overwhelming. People reached out to him from all over the country, thanking him for his words, for his courage. But Malik knew this wasn't just about him. This was about something much larger than one person. It was about a movement that needed every voice to be heard, every person to stand up. He began to work more closely with the advocacy group, helping them organize events, rallies, and discussions about racial justice. He wasn't just a participant anymore, he was becoming a leader. He was speaking at schools, churches, community centers, and even law offices. His story was being shared, and with every word he spoke, more and more people were beginning to understand the depth of the problem. But the journey wasn't easy. Malik faced backlash, of course. There were people who called him an angry black man, people who accused him of playing the race card. But he didn't let that stop him. He knew the truth of what he was saying, and the people who truly mattered would listen. One day, after a particularly heated debate with a group of conservative pundits who tried to discredit him, Malik sat down with Claire Thompson again. "You were right, you know," Malik said, looking at her with a mix of exhaustion and pride. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about all of us. All the people who've been wronged, who've been silenced, who've been invisible. And I think we're starting to make a difference." Claire smiled, a proud gleam in her eyes. "Malik, you've already made a difference. You've done something that most people can only dream of, you've sparked a conversation. And that conversation will grow. Change is coming, but it starts with people like you." Months passed, and Malik's life continued to evolve. He graduated from college with a degree in pre-law and received offers to work with some of the best law firms in the country. But what Malik really wanted was to create his own path. He wanted to become a lawyer, not to defend those who were already part of the system, but to challenge the system itself. He wanted to make sure that every person, regardless of race, background, or circumstances, had the opportunity to succeed. One day, after finishing a community rally, Malik stood on a street corner, looking at the skyline in front of him. He had come a long way since that day in the courtroom, but there was still so much work to do. The fight for racial justice wasn't over, and it wasn't something that would end with one victory. But Malik knew that with every step he took, with every story he shared, and with every person who joined him in the fight, they were all making a difference. And that was just the beginning. Please support by liking, subscribing, and sharing if Malik's journey has inspired you. Your support makes a world of difference in helping us continue to share these powerful stories and bring about real change. Thank you for being part of this movement. The years that followed Malik's trial were a blur of triumphs and challenges, victories and setbacks. His voice became stronger with each passing day, resonating with more people, more communities, and more causes. He had become a beacon for racial justice, not just because of his story, but because he refused to let anyone else's story go unheard. As Malik's platform grew, he began to collaborate with other activists, lawyers, and organizations to push for real change. He participated in discussions about police reform, youth incarceration, and the impact of systemic racism on education and employment. His words were not just heard, they were felt, deeply. And slowly but surely, Malik started to see the impact of his work. One day, he received an invitation from a senator who had been following his journey. The senator, known for her advocacy of criminal justice reform, wanted Malik to speak at a national conference on racial equality. She believed that Malik's story could help bring the issue of racial injustice to the forefront of the political agenda. It was a pivotal moment, a recognition that Malik's voice could help influence policy. "Malik," the senator said during their meeting, "we need more people like you in the conversation. You've seen the system firsthand. You know what needs to change. Your experience will make a difference in how we shape the future of this country." Malik couldn't believe it. His thoughts went back to that first day in the courtroom, when he was just a teenager with a dream of proving the world wrong. He had never imagined that he would be sitting at the table with policymakers, trying to shape the laws that had failed him and so many others. Malik stood before the conference audience, thousands of faces staring up at him. The lights were bright, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. But for the first time in his life, Malik didn't feel nervous. He felt powerful. His hands were steady, his voice clear, as he addressed the room. "I didn't come here to tell you a sob story," Malik began. "I didn't come here to talk about my trial as some sort of isolated incident. I'm here because what happened to me happens every day to people who look like me. To young black men, to young black women, to people of color who are treated as if their lives don't matter." The room was silent, all eyes on him as his words filled the space. "For far too long, the system has been rigged against us. It's not just the police, it's not just the courts. It's education, it's healthcare, it's employment, it's everything. But I'm here to tell you that we can change that. We can change the laws, the policies, the systems that have been designed to keep us down. We can fight for a better future for our children, for our communities." Malik's voice rose with conviction. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been overlooked, misunderstood, or dismissed. His words were not just an appeal, they were a call to action. "We need more than just reform," Malik continued. "We need a revolution in how we see each other. We need to look at each other not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of humanity. We need to listen to each other, to stand up for each other, and to demand that our voices are heard." The audience erupted into applause, but Malik wasn't done. He had one final message. Change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen because one person speaks up. It happens when all of us come together, when we unite to fight for what's right. So, I'm asking you, no, I'm challenging you, to keep this fight going. Don't stop here. Don't let this be just another moment. Let this be the beginning of real, lasting change. Malik's speech at the conference became a turning point not just for him, but for the movement he had inadvertently started. Media outlets, political figures, and ordinary people began talking about the need for systemic change. Malik's journey from the courtroom to the national stage became a symbol of hope, hope that things could be different, that change was possible if people were willing to fight for it. Years later, Malik found himself at the helm of an organization dedicated to advocating for racial justice and equality. The organization worked tirelessly to address issues such as police brutality, the school-to-prison pipeline, and employment discrimination. Malik wasn't just an advocate anymore, he was a leader, a visionary. And his work was making a difference. The impact of Malik's story rippled across the nation. Schools invited him to speak to students, and he traveled around the world, sharing his message of hope, change, and unity. His story wasn't just one of overcoming adversity, it was a story about how ordinary people, when united, could create extraordinary change. It had been a decade since that pivotal day in the courtroom. Malik sat in his office, looking out the window at the busy city streets. His organization had helped to enact new policies aimed at addressing racial inequality, and he had seen firsthand how his efforts had contributed to lasting change. As Malik sat there, reflecting on his journey, there was a knock on his door. Claire Thompson, his former defense attorney, walked in, a smile on her face. "You've come a long way, Malik," Claire said, her voice filled with pride. Malik smiled back, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "I couldn't have done it without you, Claire. You believed in me when no one else did. None of us believed in you more than you believed in yourself," she said, sitting down across from him. "You were always destined for greatness." Malik looked at her, his mind racing with the memories of his trial, his struggles, and the fight that had defined his life. He had never asked for any of this. He had never asked to be the symbol of a movement. But he had become that, and so much more. He had become the change he wanted to see. "Sometimes I still can't believe it all happened," Malik said, shaking his head. "But here we are." "And here you are," Claire replied with a smile. "The fight's not over, Malik. But you've laid the foundation for the future." Malik stood up, walking over to the window and looking out at the horizon. He had come full circle. From the young black teen accused and underestimated, to a leader, an advocate, and a symbol of hope for millions. He knew the work was far from over, but he also knew that the fight for justice, equality, and dignity would always continue. And as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would never stop fighting. Please support by liking, subscribing, and sharing if you've been inspired by Malik's journey and want to see more stories like this. Together, we can keep pushing for change and equality for all. Your support makes a difference. Thank you for being a part of the movement.